I mentioned yesterday, while a relatively junior member, obviously, of the Banking Committee, there was no member of this chamber, Madam President, that added as much to this bill as the senator from Virginia did. And I can't, there aren't words or time to me adequately express my gratitude to him for his involvement. Literally almost on an hourly basis was involved, and along with Senator Corker of Tennessee, they literally spent hours on their own, meeting and talking with other people about how to fashion two of the most critical titles of this bill. And so let me just express my gratitude once again to Senator Mark Warner of Virginia, and thank him immensely for your contribution. Did a great job.
Madam President.
Senator from Virginia.
I want to thank the chair for those kind remarks. And you said there's not time or words, but if you'd like to take some more time or words to thank, I would be happy to. But let me again thank the chair and to say it's I think a good feeling that all of us who've labored on this, the members, the staff, that it's coming finally to a successful conclusion, and that the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform and Consumer Protection Act is going into law. And I think it will stand as those equally controversial pieces of legislation in the 1930s that stood the test of time for decades. I think this bill will stand the test of time for decades as well, in terms of creating a new set of rules of the road for not just America's financial sector, but in a sense, the world's financial sector for decades to come. And while not perfect, and no piece of legislation is, one of the things that gives me some confidence that the right balance has been struck is that this bill has been criticized by both the left and the right. Some on the left, some on the Democratic side, saying the bill has not gone far enough in putting more requirements and restrictions on our financial institutions. Some of my colleagues on the Republican side and on the right have said this bill goes too far. The fact that it is getting perhaps that left and right criticism puts us maybe in that just right in the middle section, which was the appropriate balance we tried to strike since the chairman started this effort well over 2 years ago. I think it's important at times that we remember why we're here today. 2 years ago, the markets were in chaos. President Bush and Secretary Paulson had created TARP, a $700 billion unprecedented bailout to shore up our financial system. President Obama was in crisis mode with our economy still in free fall from day one. The Dow was at 6,500, and there was a lot of talk of nationalizing banks. Well, close to a year and a half to 2 years later, we have seen stimuluses and stress tests. We've seen a Dow that now has touched 11,000, and while the economy is not creating jobs at the rate any of us would like to see, the talk of financial Armageddon or complete collapse has disappeared. Now, I think we went into this process with three goals. First, the taxpayers must never again hear that a company is too big to fail. Second, that we had to fix our regulatory system to make sure that the huge gaps that existed that allowed systemic regulatory arbitrage could no longer take place. And that finally, consumers and investors had to have confidence that our markets were fair, transparent, and that there would be a cop on the beat to make sure that some of the excesses that took place in 2005, 2006, 2007, where folks were being put into homes they could never afford to pay for, or financial instruments that were being created under the guise of lowering the cost of risk that were more about simply creating fee income, would never again prey on unwary investors or on homeowners that got themselves into problem. Now, I think one of the most interesting critiques that some still make of the bill is that we've not addressed too big to fail. More candidly, with the United States moving first on this legislation and the rest of the world waiting for the United States to move, we hear from our European colleagues that the framework that we've set up, actually, they hope to emulate. we created a new regulatory structure so that the regulators could get out of their silos, depository institutions on one side, security institutions on another, derivatives trading on a third, and make sure that we had a full systemic risk council, so that we measured risk wherever it exists, regardless of the charter of the organization. And while some said we ought to go ahead and limit the asset size of some of our institutions just on size alone, I think the chairman wisely decided that as we went through a year and a half of hearings, what often precipitated the greatest risks to our system was not size alone. America's only got 4 of the 50 largest banks in the world. But it was the interconnectedness, their leverage, the failure to have appropriate risk management plans in place. This new Systemic Risk Council is specifically charged with making sure our large, more complex institutions have more stringent capital requirements, leverage ratios, liquidity requirements, and risk management tools. We've even created 2 whole new categories that, while not fully tested, and both of these categories actually came from colleagues on the other side of the aisle, could be important new steps to prevent these large institutions from failing. One is contingent debt that large institutions would have to have, that if they get themselves even close to trouble, that debt would convert into equity, consequently diluting existing shareholders and management and keeping pressure on the board to make sure that management wouldn't take that risk. And finally, a tool that, again, I think if implemented correctly, will be tremendously powerful. And that is to ensure that all of these large, complex institutions provide a plan about how they will be able to unwind in an orderly fashion through traditional bankruptcy provisions. And our goal is to always have bankruptcy to be the appropriate response. And if that liquidation plan or if that debt plan is not blessed by the Council of Regulators, the Council of Regulators can dismember, break up, or put other restrictions on these large institutions. Senator Dodd made, I think, the decision to task my good friend Senator Corker from Tennessee and I with this issue. If those processes still don't work, how do we make sure that you've got an orderly liquidation process? And our goal was 2. 1, taxpayers should never be able to have to bear the risk. And 2, that if an entity goes into liquidation, it will not come out. Liquidation or resolution is not an attempt to stand up an institution, but we wanted to make clear to shareholders, to management, that if you go into resolution, you're toast, as my colleague Senator Corker often said. We think we have reached that goal, and I'm proud that particularly Titles I and Title II of this bill, actually, when Chairman Dodd and Senator Shelby put some amendments to it, were endorsed by 95 of our colleagues, the broadest bipartisan section of this legislation. This bill addresses a number of other vital areas as well. It allows a single depository place to get the appropriate day-to-day information on our financial institutions that still didn't exist until we created the Financial Services Oversight Council, and the ability to get on a daily basis the level of interconnectedness of a future AIG. It puts in place a Consumer Protection Bureau to make sure, for example, that mortgages are regulated in a way that consumers can understand regardless of the charter of the organization. We often found banks had a fairly good ability to regulate some of their mortgages, whereas mortgage lenders and others who were unregulated had no such restrictions. Now we've got an even playing field. And it finally puts in place, and there's still some debate on this issue, an appropriate process to regulate derivatives and bring these critical but potentially dangerous instruments out of the shadows. And the vast majority of these instruments now will be traded in a more transparent way on exchanges. Now, there's more to be done. Domestic and international implementation is vitally important. And as I mentioned at the outset, the United States, and this is one of the things that is kind of remarkable when I hear from some of my colleagues that we move too quickly or this bill does too much. Well, candidly, the whole rest of the world has been waiting on America to act to set the template for broad-based financial reform Now that we have acted, I think particularly Europe and Asia will follow our stead. But making sure that we do this in an appropriate international implementation is terribly important. The Basel circumstances, but also making sure that we've got the regulatory approach across the world correct so there's not international ability to arbitrage with these large financial institutions. I know some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have also raised the question that this bill didn't fully address the GSEs. They're right. But I think it was the right and conscious decision of the chair and others that to disrupt already a still fragile housing market at this moment in time in a piece of legislation that has already been accused by some as being too broad and covering too many items was not the appropriate choice. We will have to come back and deal with GSEs. We've got to make sure, though, that as we deal with GSEs, international implementation, that we stay vigilant. We have given the regulators the tools. How they use these tools will be up to us in Congress to make sure that they are implemented correctly with appropriate oversight. Now, I am in certain ways disappointed this bill didn't pass with broader bipartisan legislation. But we only got here because there was bipartisan support. And I want to close with acknowledging, again, the Chairman was very kind in his remarks, but I can't think in my short tenure here in the United States Senate, any senator that's worked harder on a piece of legislation, that's been more relentless, that's had more twists and turns, that's had more, we're there, oh my gosh, but we may not be there, that's probably had more 10 o'clock, 2 o'clock in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, I believe at one point, telephone calls, meetings with other members. As the senator from Texas mentioned earlier, even though the senator from Texas couldn't support the overall bill, our chairman has worked with all members, regardless of party, to try to accommodate their interests. And I again commend the senator from Texas for pointing out the fact that, for example, community-based and independent banks come out of this legislation as one of the real winners in terms of their ability to have a more fair competition with the larger institutions. So I want to commend the chairman. I want to commend all of my colleagues on both sides of the aisle, even those who perhaps couldn't vote for the final product, but were part of building the product, and that their ideas were implemented. I think this piece of legislation will, when we think about the Glass-Steagall, when we think about the bills that created the SEC, when we think about the legislation that in the 30s, in the moments of crisis, created the financial framework for 20th century American capitalism, that what this bill has done, and there'll be work done to improve, to fully implement, but what this bill has done has set a framework for 21st century American capitalism, and in a certain way, the framework for 21st century capitalism across the world, in a way that America can remain the center for financial markets, but at the same time make sure that both consumers and the investing public is protected in this new and very challenging world.